DC motor out of a Heatcraft evaporator unit. They're used in a lot of different things as well. So, you know, they want list price over $700 for this particular fan motor. You can get them new for around $300. But this fan's only about a year and a half old, and so rather than replace it and charge the customer, you know, we want to rebuild this. Okay, so you can see things a little clearer now. Like I say, it's a 1/8 inch set screw. We got it off, pops off. So if you look here, you can absolutely see the shaft moving around. So we know that it's the bearing is the problem. So what we're going to do now is remove these 4 bolts here to get this cage assembly off, and we're also going to remove these 2 through bolts going through. But before we do that, we're going to put it on its side. We're going to match mark the casing. So basically from here to here, we're going to just draw a line to make sure it all lines up. That's really critical for this all to work. Alright? Okay, so we've got the cage off. We've got the 2 through bolts done. We have also match marked this unit right here. So what we're going to do now, it looks like it's totally sealed, like you think that this thing can't come apart, but this is like some kind of vinyl tape that's around here, right where the iron core is, right here. So we're actually going to cut this out of the way just with a razor blade. It just cuts, just cut it off, and so I'll cut it away, and then you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, so you can see we've just cut it, so now you can see the iron core here in between. Now, here's where it gets a little bit sensitive, and you got to be careful. If you'll notice, the wire goes in the bottom of the housing. So when you pry this away, you want to leave the iron core with the bottom, so it stays with the wire, because it's connected internally, and so you'll pull a whole bunch of little wires apart if you do it that way. So you want to leave the iron core in the bottom and pry. So you'll notice that there's a couple pry spots, which are pretty cool. Right here, for example, here's a low spot right there. So you actually put your screwdriver in like this and then just pop it up. So I'll pop it and then I'll come back so you can see it. I can't do 2 things at once and hold the camera. So here it is, partially pried. Again, this core will want to separate off the bottom. You got to just keep it held together, and you actually have to get up with a small screwdriver up in it so you can pry it back to leave the iron core on the bottom. So you do a little bit on both sides until it comes apart. So we'll come back in a minute. The main rotor here is just a series of neodymium magnets that are just in a ring here, okay? So if you have a look in here, this is these things are incredibly simple really in some respects. Here it is, you can see inside all the electronics down in the bottom there. It's pretty delicate here at the top. You got to watch, this is the sensors right here, but basically what you do now is clean out all the bearing material. Now, I'll show you on assembly a couple things you have to watch out for, but here you can see the rear bearing. If I bring it in close enough, if it'll focus, I don't think it will this close, but these are made in China bearings. The rear one is in pretty good shape, but the front one you're going to see is totally tore out, so we'll get this apart and you can have a look. Okay, so you can see inside here, this is the front cover. There's a little foam casing thing that goes back in. Here's the bearing, and you can see it's just begun to separate. And you can see all the pieces of bearing are coming apart, and they're actually stuck all around the magnet. You see the bearings, you can see all the bearings in here. This thing is pretty well toast. So what we're going to do now is use a standard puller to pull these bearings off. Okay, so you can see here I've got an automotive style puller on here. So we're just going to pull this rear bearing off. Again, this is just a Harbor Freight cheap puller. There's all kinds of different ones you can buy very inexpensively. And so we're just going to take this rear bearing off, and then we'll show you how to take the front one off. Sometimes you have to be a little bit creative. You can see here I had to take a socket so that it could go inside on the shaft, so I had enough collar space to be able to push this out. So that's why that's on there. Okay, so here we are. We got the rear one off. The rear bearing is off. Now we're pulling the inner race that's still left on the front after the front bearing disintegrated. So again, using the same puller, and we're just going to get that off. Okay, what's great about this front shaft, where the bearing actually goes, and you can see there's like a line, so you need to kind of make note of that to know when you're pushing your new one on. But when it comes out about, I don't know, ½ inch, 3/4 inch, the shaft out here is smaller, so you don't actually have to pull it all the way out. It only pulls out about ½ inch and it pops right off. So that's the inner race of the front bearing that's gone bad. Okay, so here's our new bearings. They look exactly the same as the old ones. These are NSK bearings made in Japan. Excellent bearings. They last probably for 15-20 years now once this thing is back together. So basically we press the bearing. We're going to press this bearing on this side, this bearing on this side. Now it's key that however you're going to do this, that you don't try to press it on using the outside of the race. You have to press it on using the inside of the race. Best thing is a 1/4 inch deep socket, one that will just fit over the shaft, yet will be in contact with the inner part. So when you're tapping it on with a hammer, you don't damage the actual bearing because you're actually pressing from the inner part of the race. All right. So that's what we're going to do now. I'll set it up here so you can see what I'm talking about. So to start it, you can use a hammer on the rear one just to get it started, and then what you do is put the socket on then. And so here is the socket that I was talking about. This particular one is a 11/32, works perfectly to tap it on, and you only put it on as far as it was on before. And so now we're going to do the same with the front one. Okay, so here we go. We've got the rear one on. We've got the front one on, and again, if you look, the color, you can tell exactly where it fits. There's two lines. There's a line up here, but that's actually where the shaft was hitting the housing when the bearing went bad. So you just have to look at it real careful. If you want to measure before you pull it off, since I've done this a couple times, I didn't have to do that. But if you measure both ends, that's real important, because this just sits in there, and it's held in place by the magnetic part on the stator here. It just sits in place and floats essentially, but you got to get the bearings close so they can sit in there properly. So now what we're going to begin to do is a couple of things. First of all, we set this rotor aside for a minute, and what we have to do is really important is make sure we clean out that there's no garbage in here from the bearings. This particular one, all the bearing material was stuck on the top and didn't fall down in, but on the other one I did, the material all fell in. So it's real important you turn it upside down, shake it out, make sure that there's no debris in there that can get caught on anything. The other thing you need to do is that the guide holes, there's two holes. If you look right here, I'm just trying to show you there you can see it part way through there. Anyway, there it is. Okay, there's a guide hole on that side and a guide hole on this side. And you need to make sure they're lined up so that you'll be able to put your through bolts through. So once we're done with this, okay, here's the next thing you do. There is a wavy spring washer right here. This fits in the bottom. So just have a look there, and he sits down in the bottom, right down in the bottom. The next thing you do is make sure that your stator is completely cleaned off of any debris. Remember, because it's a magnet, it basically sucks up everything and anything. So next thing you do is carefully just put him down, and again, it's going to kind of suck into place. And you just push him down in, and again, you just make sure there's no debris, alright? And then what we begin to do is get ready to put the cover on, alright? So that's the next step. Okay, once we have the rotor back into place, we now can take the lid, the top, make sure this is a foamy material that's in the top here, make sure that it's still in place and all good. And then what you have to do is line up these two holes with the through holes that are in here. So that's the next step. So I found the easiest way is just put the bolts in like this, just loose, and then guide the whole thing in. And then make sure that everything lines up the way it should. And I see that I didn't line it up, so I have to swap it around. I have to turn this thing around. So let me just do that. Here we go. Lining up everything again. There we go. So you can see my two lines are lined up there, and basically just kind of squish it down. That's what seems to fit tight. And then you can check the rotor. Now it cogs, meaning that there's a magnetic cogging. It gets caught in certain spots. It's not the bearings. It's supposed to do that. But you can see that it rotates freely. It just gets caught, kind of. But it's not a mechanical catching. It's the magnet catching. And that's normal, and that's just okay. So what we do now is put the nuts on these two things. Put the nuts on these two bolts. pull everything snugly together, and then put the cage back on. That's the next step. Okay, it's really important once you tighten these two nuts, make sure the housing was all pushed in nice and firm, then you've tightened these snug. You now check this and make sure that the shaft moves freely, there's no mechanical grinding, it's not rubbing anywhere inside. And if you got the bearings spaced the same as they were when you took them off, should be perfect. And you see it turns freely, but again it cogs, but don't worry about that, alright? Next thing we do now, before we put this cage on, and I forgot about this, is you take good quality electrical tape and you go around twice around this. And again, this is just to keep the iron core from getting moisture on it so it gets all rusty and then splits apart. You've probably seen that on old motors in the past, and I think that's why they put it on there, to seal it. Alright, so that's the next step, is to put two rolls of tape around it. Just, 2 layers of tape. Alright, so here we are, all back together. Bearings feel good. What's nice is a lot of these evaporators have 2 motors in them, so if one goes bad and the other one's functioning, you can at least pull it out and service it while the other one's going. So if you have to take a couple days to get the parts, I got the bearings online. Again, I got for like under $20, I was able to rebuild both of these units. If the fan breaks, I did have a problem with the other one where the fan just would not come off, so I had to cut it off. I was able to get that online for $17 for the fan for the other unit, but this one came off, so there wasn't any problem with it. So again, this is a real money saver. For under $20 to put bearings in these things, I don't think you can go wrong. Even if you end up replacing a couple of these, and then buying new ones and then rebuilding these to have them ready to install in other units in case there's a rush, that's fine. But I just can't see paying this amount of money just to put China bearings back in, because when you get another one of these from the manufacturer, you're just going to get another one that in a year and a half, 2 years is going to go bad. And how does that look for you as the supplier and installer? Or if you're the end user, the customer, do you want to do this over and over again? Or do you want to do it once and know that it's going to work well? Couple side notes. You will notice that there are 2 holes. You can't see them because there's not enough color contrast, but here and here. When you're installing these things back in, make sure those holes are located on the bottom end where gravity, in case moisture does get in the unit, the water can get out. Make sure those holes are installed downward, alright? That's all there is to it.